what we would do is go straight in to having a look at an EPC. So there's an EPC, and you'll see this is for a property in Cambridge, 10 Moyne Close, which has a D rating. The first thing to point out to you, and this may surprise you, there are two versions of this EPC. So the EPC you see in front of you is one that I've actually got from the government website. And if you're wanting to look up your own property, the best thing to do is search EPC register and then go on to the .gov.uk website, and you will get a much more detailed EPC than, for example, the one that we get sent by the assessor, and you'll find that really helpful. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this sort of thing, that is the graph that this EPC reflects. And it's been prepared by an accredited energy assessor who looks at the fabric of the property. He looks at the heating, lighting, and hot water and puts it into a prescribed software, which then produces a graph like the one you have in front of you. And in this particular case, you can see that it's a D, and you can see between each of the letters, there's a different range. A is the most efficient, G is the least efficient. And in this case, you also see not only is it a D, but it has 67. And then if you have a quick look to the left and to the C, you'll realize you only need a further 2 points to make it a C. On the top right-hand side, you see a B in green and an 84. And in theory, and I'll explain that further, that's the maximum this property could achieve. Now, I think it's quite helpful to see how they make the calculations up. But before we look at some of these particular issues, I think it's helpful to make some general comments. The first is the assessor will only make his calculations on what he can see. So, for example, if you have already had cavity wall insulation done, then you need to make sure the assessor knows that, because otherwise he'll assume it hasn't been done. And then similarly, if you take, for example, the loft insulation, it's quite common for there to be insulation, but the assessor won't actually look. And so it's really important to make sure that any information you have, any work that you carry out, is produced to the assessor to make sure you get the best result. The other thing to say is we're going to be looking in a minute at some of the suggestions. I'd say two things about the suggestions. The first is some are totally unrealistic, as I'm going to show you. And the second is when you do look at these EPCs and you look at the estimates for what it's going to cost, some of those are also unrealistic. I think as you go through this, and as you do this on your own property, you're going to need to work out what your aims are. For some of you, it will be simply to get the best EPC so you can rent the property out. For some of you, you're going to want to make sure it's the most energy efficient. And for some of you, it's going to be the most environmentally friendly. And then for others, it'll be a combination of the two. But you do need to be able to work out what you're trying to achieve in the way you approach this once you get to look at your own property. So let's have a quick look at this list. These are the factors that the energy assessor is going to look at. So the first thing he'll look at are the walls, the exterior walls, and he's going to assess whether it has a cavity. Now, quite a lot of the properties in Cambridge are solid brick, and I'll come to that in a minute. But if it is a cavity wall, he will not know whether there's that there's been cavity insulation unless we're able to show it that it's been done. Generally, cavity wall insulation can be quite expensive for what it actually achieves, but it can be quite good from an efficiency point of view. So perhaps I ought to clarify that. When I say it's expensive for what it achieves, that is in the EPC rather than the energy effectiveness. Now, what if you've got a solid brick wall? Well, there are a number of options. There are some houses where you can insulate on the exterior and you can put effectively a render. The alternative, of course, is to insulate on the inside, but that is almost certainly prohibitively expensive to do that. And if you want, I can explain why later on. And then we look at the roof, the loft insulation. As I've said, invariably, the assessor doesn't really look to see what's there. Now, here, he's assumed 150, and almost certainly it's got 250, and my recommendation is always put 300. And that will make a big difference to the heat retention within the house. Windows. Now, not every property has double glazing. If it doesn't and has the potential and you plan to put double glazing, then I would suggest you look at the U value of the double glazing that you're going to install. At present, it makes no difference. They simply say it has double glazing. But as I'm going to explain in a moment, they are about to change that. So how energy efficient the windows are that you install in double glazing will be assessed and make a difference in the future. Now, some of you will have Victorian properties, and that makes it very much harder. It may be you can put double glazed sash windows. They are very expensive. It may be you'll have to consider putting secondary glazing. Older properties generally are much harder to make energy efficient. Heating, boiler and radiators. The assessor does take into account the rating of your boiler. They will look at the make, the model of your boiler and insert that into their software, and that will come up with a rating. So if you haven't and you are going to install a new boiler, it will make a big difference if you make sure you put an A-rated boiler. And even then, you could put an A double plus boiler in, and that would make it even more efficient. Some of you may be considering putting air source heat pumps in. Currently, if you put an air source heat pump in, actually it makes no benefit to your EPC rating and on occasion can make it look worse. But again, new regulations are coming in next year when that will be different, and that will make a difference and improve your EPC rating. Heating controls, main heating controls. I've asked the assessor, how do you get more than good? And the answer is you need to have remotely controlled, electronically controlled thermostats. And probably in rental properties, that's not a good idea because there'll always be technical problems and they'll never work as smoothly as they promise they will be. But that's the only way of getting more than a good on your TVRs and heating controls. Hot water, here you see that it says good. And later on, we're going to look at the fact that they always recommend using solar to heat your hot water. I'll come back to that later on. Lighting, low energy lighting bulbs. It just makes common sense to make sure that all the light bulbs are energy efficient. And that's a very basic thing to do. And then floor. And now that's very interesting because we have a combination of floors. Some are solid, some are suspended floors, and some have been properly insulated. And some of the Victorian properties have these wonderful wooden floors. And so you as an owner need to assess what you've got and what the options are. If you're looking at a solid floor, as in this case, you're going to see it's recommended that that's insulated. I want to suggest that's completely ludicrous because what do? Do you raise up the doors when you do that? Or do you actually remove the solid floor to put the insulation in. And the suggestion, as in this case, it'll cost £6,000 is completely pie in the sky. It'll cost 10, 15, 20,000. So if you've got a solid floor, I suggest there's very little you can do. If you have a suspended floor, well, you could consider lifting them all and putting insulation and then putting a new floor. But to give you an idea, I did a calculation on a 2-bedroom ground floor apartment. That was 60 square meters. And without the new floor, just whipping it up, putting the insulation was going to cost £5,000. And in that case, for an improvement of 2 points. So that isn't usually an attractive option. Of course, those of you who've got Victorian properties, you then might say, well, what are we going to do? I think that's really difficult. There are people offering to spray foam underneath. And the research I have done says that I personally wouldn't do it. And interestingly, I looked at that on the 2-bedroom apartment I've just referred to, and it was going to cost 4,000 or 5,000, very similar to lifting the floorboards. So again, it's really difficult when you've got a old-fashioned Victorian property with lovely wooden floors. I think those are all the points there. So those are the factors that the energy assessor is going to look at. Let's just have a look at this particular example and let me highlight a few things. So in this case, they have suggested that we put in cavity wall insulation. And interestingly, if you quickly look up here, you will see that the assessment is 67 points on the yellow. And here they're saying we can improve it to a 72, which is 5 points, which is actually quite good because sometimes it's only 2 points. They estimate the cost of 500 to 1,500. I did suggest to you earlier on that it might cost more, and I've had a quote, and it's 1,850 to do the cavity wall insulation. They then recommend the solid floor is insulated for a cost of £4,000 to £6,000. And as I've explained to you, I just cannot see how that is viable at all. Low energy lighting, absolutely a must. In this case, it makes no difference, but I still think it's a sensible thing to do. Solar water heating, again, now I haven't touched on that. They nearly always recommend it. And if you look here, it gives you just 1 point for spending £6,000. And personally, I don't think that's economically sensible way of improving the property. But if you're someone who wants to do everything environmentally, then you may wish to consider doing that. But we then get to what I think is a very interesting thing, and that is putting the solar panels on. You see, in this illustration, they show that if we were to put 2.5 kilowatts, we could improve it by 9 points. Now, I've done some calculations. I've had someone come in and measure up for the solar panels. And if we were to put 2.5 kilowatts, the cost is £6,000. If we were to put, did I say that's 2.5 kilowatts? If we put 4 kilowatts on this property, that would cost us £7,500 and would take it from a D straight away to a B. So for £7,500, I can go from a D to a B. And then, of course, if I did the cavity wall insulation on this property, it would make it really very energy efficient. But putting solar can be a really good way of improving the energy efficiency of your property. And it also has 2 other benefits. You, as the owner, will get the feed-in tariff, and you're going to get something in excess of £500 a year. And then in promoting the property, again, I've done the calculations for this particular property, and on today's capped rates, the tenants would enjoy, if they used all of it, about £1,000 worth of electricity. So quite a nice benefit for the tenants quite an attractive thing to do. Well, I hope that just gives you a little bit of a glimpse of what it is when you look at an EPC. I think it's worth now touching on why we have to have an EPC and what the changes are going to be. So if you don't already know, an EPC has been a legal requirement since 2008. An EPC lasts for 10 years, and it has to be done if it's sold, if it's let, or it's constructed. There are some exemptions. So you're exempt in some cases if you have a listed building, not automatically. You're exempt if you have a holiday let for less than 4 months. And you are exempt if it is less than 50 square meters. Otherwise, you must have an EPC. Now, this is where the nub comes. Currently, you must have an EPC, which is an E. But for some time, the government have been saying we want to increase that to a C and eventually to a B. Now, they were always saying it's going to happen in 2025. I'm now advised by someone who I think has some pretty good inside information. It looks as if by 2026, all new tenancies will have to have a C, and all existing tenancies will have to have a C by 2028. And then probably all new tenancies will need to be a B by 2030. Now, let me just touch on the C and the B. Personally, I think that if you're going to improve your property and you can achieve it, I would recommend you go straight to a B. And I'm going to give you some very good reasons for doing that a little later on. But it's worth, in my view, skipping the C and going to a B if you can do that. Now, I know some of the Victorian properties will find that difficult, but I think it's worth doing. There's another change afoot, which I have alluded to, and that is the way in which they calculate EPCs. Now, energy assessors use something called standard assessment procedure. However, when they do domestic houses, they do something called a reduced data standard assessment procedure. So what that is basically a simplified version. And that is revised every 2 years. And they've revised it for 2022. And it may not surprise you, they haven't implemented it. But the indication is it's going to be implemented next year. And the relevance for us and for you is it's going to be much more focused. So, for example, I mentioned air source heat pumps, and that means that that will be taken into account. We touched on solid walls, and that's going to be taken into account. So the fact you have a solid wall at present gives you absolutely no benefit at all. But depending on the solid wall, it might help improve your EPC, and so on. So it's been quite updated in all sorts of ways. So for some of you, if you're just trying to nudge it up a bit with the least cost, you might be worth waiting until SAP 22 comes in force. There's one other important thing that you need to be aware of, and this is particularly relevant for those of you who've got Victorian properties, and you look at your EPC, and it basically says you will not even get to a C, and you think to yourselves, what am I going to do? And the answer is you can rely on an exemption, and the exemption works like this. It basically says, under current regulations, if you have to spend more than £3,500 improving your property, you can apply for an exemption. That is going to change to £10,000. I don't yet know when, but I suspect it'll be next year. When that comes in, if you can show that, for example, you've spent easy money, you've done the lighting, you've done various little things, you've got a good heating system, TVRs and all those things, and that's taken you up to a cost of $3,000. And then you say, well, actually, the only thing I can do now is insulate the outside walls and insulate the and that is going to cost me or the inside of the walls, that's going to cost me another £8,000, taking you over the 10,000. So if it takes you over the £10,000, then you can apply for an exemption. Now, as part of that, you also need to be aware that there is a set date. And the set date is when that 10,000 starts to accumulate. So if you are thinking of relying on that 10,000 exemption, then you need to wait until the set date has started, and it hasn't yet. In which case, wait for the set date, then start doing the work, then say, I'm sorry, it's going to cost me more than £10,000. Please, can I apply for an exemption? I'm nearly finished, but I would like to say why I think improving your EPC is to your advantage. The first reason for improving your EPC is there is no doubt, and it won't surprise you, that tenants are very savvy these days, and they look at the EPCs, they look at how much it's going to cost them to live in a property. And we have already experienced some tenants leaving properties saying, I'm sorry, this property is too expensive to live in. So from a purely commercial point of view, to attract tenants who can afford to live there, it makes sense to do the EPC. The second thing I've already mentioned, which is the benefit of something like solar, both to the tenants, but also to yourselves with the FIT payment. The other reason is the value you will add to your property. So Rightmove have done all sorts of calculations, not least of which saying that those properties with a higher EPC now sell quicker. People search for them. But they've also shown that if you improve your EPC, it will improve the value of your property. So they have issued statistics, and if you were to have from an E to a B, they calculate you would improve the value of your property by 10%. Oh, no, sorry, maybe 15%. So my mind's gone blank. It could be 50. I think it's 15%. I do apologize. I think it's 15%. So, but take, for example, the house I've just shown you, 10 Moyne Close. If we were to spend £7,500 putting solar in there, I have calculated, and we get it to a B, I think we've increased the value of that house from conservatively between £20,000 and £25,000. And I think that is another incentive for us as landlords to do it. And then, of course, there's the incentive of making sure that we help the environment and the improvement we're making for people who are living in these homes. So that's a little summary, and I hope it's a little taster into EPCs. And in a moment, I'm going to invite you to ask me questions, and I'll do my very best to answer them. How can we help you as Cambridge Property Lettings? Well, we're very happy to offer a service where we will talk with you on Zoom. We will discuss what your aims are, look at your EPC, and consider some of the options. We will then get quotes. We'll physically look at the property, see what needs doing, and then we will also have to employ an assessor. Let me just explain why. When you look at the EPC, and on the right-hand side it says, this will give you 4 points, this will give you 8 points, they're looking at it sequentially. So if you don't do everything that the EPC says, we then need to get an assessor to put it through their software to make sure it's going to achieve what you want before we go ahead. And we would then cover that. And if you asked us to help you, and we appreciate that all of you will want that, which is fine, then we will charge £350 to do that. And then if you then decide to go ahead with the work, we will charge 12% on the work that we do, and anything that in excess of our £350, we'll take that off, and we'll set it off what we would charge you for overseeing and organising the work. So that's how we would like to try and help you.